Well, I told him I was going to do it. I mean, I can't play Dr. Robert every time. Robert Rodriguez joins us to discuss the Beatles. Robert Rodriguez has written many books on the Fab Four, including Solo in the 70s, Revolver, Fab Four FAQ 2.0, among others. And he's back with us to discuss a very important year in Beatle history. This year, 2014. Robert, how you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's always a pleasure. And this year has been, quite a year for the Beatles. Obviously, it was the 50th anniversary of their arrival in the United States. Of course, people across the pond are probably tired of hearing about it and maybe don't think of it as being quite as big a deal. But it certainly was here, and there were a lot of events and releases. There always are, I suppose, every year. There's various things that come out, but maybe it just seemed a little more significant because of the anniversary this year.
Well, 50 is a big number. You know, it's a hard one to ignore, especially with the media looking to latch onto anything they can kind of use as a hook for things. And, this year, 50, the big bang being the whole Ed Sullivan commemoration at the beginning of the year, that was something you knew was going to be a very big media-driven event, and so it was.
So let's get right into it. And I think the very first release we got, hot on the heels of the iTunes dump of copyright protection stuff, which for me might be the best release of 2013. But not many people know about it, unfortunately. But the first release of the year, to tie in with this whole 50th anniversary celebration, and when I saw the news about this, I'm talking about the Beatles U.S. albums box, I thought, they've done it. They've come up with a way to make me buy these CDs again. We've had the British albums and that configuration for so long that you start to feel nostalgic for the American albums. There's just something about a Beatles 65 and a Yesterday and Today.
Despite knowing how they were thrown together, by the in-house rock and roll hater at Capitol Records, Dave Dexter, and how little thought was given as to, well, we should really hold out for the proper stereo masters. Nah, let's just throw it out there and do a phonic. Nobody cares. The fake stereo.
Right.
Despite all that, despite the evident lack of care, some of them, despite themselves, hold up really well. And, you recognize that millions of fans got turned on to the Beatles in this format. They didn't care of the echo-laden tracks that were thrown out there or the high end being channeled to one side and the low end to the other. They didn't care. It was Beatles. It was fresh. It was exciting. And, just like anything else, it's a part of your DNA from that, window of opportunity when you're young and it seeps into your DNA. You get nostalgic for that, and that's what you want to hear. And oh boy, here's the opportunity to get them in one fell swoop, all cleaned up and, on CD. You're chomping at the bit to be able to enjoy this thing. And then what?
Yeah. Then we suddenly realize we're not going to get the echo-swamped version of I Feel Fine and She's a Woman and several others. Instead, what we're going to get is essentially the 2009 remasters, just in different packaging.
Yep, and state-of-the-art, nice little recreations of the Capitol albums with the inner sleeve and all the other albums being advertised, and you get the artwork, which is nice,
yes,
even though it's CD size. But yeah, musically, you're not getting anything you couldn't have done between the stereo and the mono boxes in 2009, because they swapped out, I think, from some 18 mixes that instead of putting out the American versions that all these American fans that now have the money to buy them all and hear them again as they did in their youth are wanting to hear, they swapped them out for the UK mixes from 2009. Yes, they sound great, and the excuse was, but this is what the Beatles would have done in 1964 had they had the means and opportunity. No, it's a bait and switch.
Right.
You're cashing in on nostalgia that people have for this stuff and really want to hear it. We know all the arguments about this wasn't the Beatles' artistic intent, and we know that Capitol just threw the stuff out there with any regard for, the Beatles', aesthetic sense. We know all that. It's like you got that when you put out the Capitol volumes 1 and 2, those sets that came out some years ago, and they never got around to volume 3. So people were expecting that this was going to be, the full bore, everything they left out the first time, all in one swoop. But it's not what they did. If they put a big disclaimer on it saying, now optimized for 2014 or something, then at least you might know what you're buying into.
Yeah.
But instead, they really led you to think that you were going to be able to recapture the authentic Capitol 60s sounds, and that wasn't what it was.
Yeah, and for a release like this, which is a historical release, I mean, right down to the packaging, like you said, with the ads for the other albums, the whole purpose of this release seemed to be, we're going to recreate for you the experience of being an American fan, buying these records when they first came out, and then they blow it.
Yeah, utterly. And, I was on a panel at the Fest for Beatle Fans in August in Chicago, and I couldn't believe I was the one guy on the panel that was arguing for what a deceptive thing this was. And everybody else was poo-pooing it. It's like, no, you're getting the best of it. It's like, yeah, we got the best of it in 2009.
Right.
We didn't need, basically you're ripping people off, for the 150 list or whatever it was to get some nice little recreations of the album covers. I remember when Chew Bops did that around 1980.
Yeah.
They held on to those things. So,
right.
At least now we didn't get the chewing gum, so whatever.
Yeah, exactly. If you like collecting miniature pictures of Beatle album covers and you like cardboard, this is really the set for you.
Yes, and it's bottomless pockets
yeah.
for this stuff. It's funny that the whole paradigm has changed. You think about all the people now growing up, getting familiar with the Beatles, that their first exposure may be through downloads
right.
or through the remastered CDs. And so these capital mixes would be a fresh, alien listening experience to them. It's like, oh, wow, so this is how my grandparents first heard the Beatles. It'd be kind of a cool thing with that appeal going for it. But no, they didn't see it as being able to, sell in enough numbers, I guess, to justify putting it out as it actually was in the 60s. They had to tweak with it.
And it's a blown opportunity. It might be the most useless Beatles release since the movie medley.
Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly. I read that very comparison time and time again. That's what people are comparing it to. It's like, you're satisfying no one.
Right.
The hardcores are displeased, and everyone else is feeling a little bit cheated because wait a minute, this isn't the '60s mix.
We're talking with Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez about 2014, the year in Beatles, and we just discussed the botched U.S. albums CD set, and hot on the heels of that release came the British mono vinyl box. Now here's a case where everything was done right.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And that the line that has been used over and over again describing this is like, this is the closest you're going to get to sitting in the recording console at EMI, hearing the Beatles as they were meant to be heard. In mono mixes that they preferred, that were the currency of the times, and they're so beautifully mastered, so perfect. Even if you were sitting in front of your turntable in 1964, 65 with a fresh mono pressing, they wouldn't have sounded this good. It'd be nice, I'm sure, given their history and habit of selling the same thing we already own several times over, maybe they'll get around to issuing a capital vinyl box set. I could see that happening, although they find a way to screw it up, I'm sure.
Well, there does seem to be a bias, and maybe there always has been, towards mono mixes of things.
Yeah, and it was mostly true, I think, at least through 66 or so. Although, you could make the case, if you listen to things on a case-by-case basis, the day that they started getting a lot more layered and complex in the recordings, Circa, Revolver, and Pepper, that's where you really kind of benefit from the space that stereo allows to give that stuff some breathing room, and so it's not just piled on top of itself. And, it's interesting to me, I'm sure you're familiar with this too, Sgt. Pepper, it's like a different album from stereo to mono for a number of different reasons. But one of the things I noticed was, I know they did stereo mix afterwards, it's almost like they fine-tuned it, because, if you grew up on the stereo, it sounds like a perfectly fine album, but then, you hear the mono later, and you hear that really awful edit between Good Morning going into Sgt. Pepper Reprise.
Right.
In the mono mixer, there's like a little stumble to it.
Yeah, it
and
is.
They fixed it in stereo. So it's like, well, mono is mostly the way people heard it in 67. It's interesting that they didn't think enough to correct that in the mono mix.
Robert, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the re-release of A Hard Day's Night on DVD, and this time it came out as part of the Criterion Collection.
If you ever wanted, on your wish list of how you would like to see the Beatles movies, produced and released, Criterion would have the top of the list, for doing it right.
Yeah.
And they didn't disappoint.
It's really the perfect way to experience that movie, and I hope Criterion gets their hands on Help.
Oh, yeah.
And Magical Mystery Tour.
And Magical Mystery Tour, let it be. Yeah. Yeah, they did a wonderful job, and I'm sure you saw some of the interviews with Giles Martin out there talking about the painstaking process of restoring the sound and the camera negatives and everything they could to make this absolutely as pristine and as fresh a viewing experience as it possibly could be. And then it was wonderful to see it out in theaters. And I was lucky enough, we've got an old, 1920s theater that's restored and full screen, state of the art in my town. And they sold out the screening that they had in summer. And to just see the range of ages of people that were there to see the Beatles on the big screen was fantastic. It's probably the closest thing we'll ever get to, reliving for the people that were around 50 years ago to see it in the theater. I know there was a lot more screaming then than there probably was now, but still that excitement, that electricity, you could really feel it. It was unbelievable.
Well, I'm a big fan of rock and roll movies, and A Hard Day's Night stands head and shoulders above all the rest. I mean, even though I've seen it about 100 times, every time I watch it, it's like seeing it for the first time. They
did everything right in terms of their quality standards of who was going to write it, who was going to direct it. We're not going to do your standard jukebox musical. If you consider the scripts they were handed and that they rejected, the film ideas, they had a real sense of, we're in this for the long term. We're going to do something that we're not going to be embarrassed by. And they certainly didn't.
We just heard the Beatles live on the Ed Sullivan Show. Of course, the Beatles' first appearance on Ed Sullivan played a big part in the 50th anniversary celebrations this year. Our guest today is Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez, and of course there was a big TV special to commemorate the Ed Sullivan Show. Well, I guess we have to go back to the Grammy Awards, which I think was the week before, where Paul came out and did his new single at that time, New, with Ringo sitting in on drums. And I believe the Ed Sullivan special was actually taped the following day, but not aired until a week later.
The next day, that's correct.
Yeah, I wouldn't watch the entire Grammys if someone paid me. But the Ed Sullivan special, I have to confess, I didn't watch it. Did you watch this special? Because I saw what it was and I said, you know what, not for me. If they just reran the original show, even though I own it, I would have watched it. Yeah.
That's if they would have focused just on that event. Throughout the thing that they threw up this year with all the various guest stars, it's like it was made for fast forwarding through DVR, because there are little segments with Paul and Ringo walking around and being questioned about the event and all that, and then Katy Perry and everybody else, stars of the day that nobody cares, in the context of a Beatle special. I'm with you on that. They could have shown the original show, intact commercials and everything. That would have been wonderful. Or they could have done like a documentary just on behind the scenes at this distance. But cramming it with all these entertainers that are absolutely irrelevant, that stuff's out there. People want to hear other people, artists of today, doing covers of Beatle material. It's out there. But don't hang it on, this reunion of Paul and Ringo to get everybody to watch it. Yeah. There's maybe 15 minutes of value out of that entire 2-hour thing.
Did you have a chance to listen? It's only been out a few weeks to the Art of McCartney CD set.
I heard excerpts of it online.
Yeah.
And again, I'm wondering. It's sort of like, did the Grammys put this together?
Right.
It's not something that I think the average McCartney fan would be much satisfied with. It's something that I'm not quite sure who it's meant to appeal to. But almost universally, everybody, my own reaction and, friends I've talked about it with, it's like, what is the point of this? It so sticks to the template of the originals, and you're not going to surpass the originals. What did they think they were doing here?
Right. Well, the majority of the tracks feature McCartney's band, basically doing them in the way that, Paul does them in concert with just the guest vocalist dubbed on top of it.
Yeah, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's like, I guess, an encapsulation of if Paul could make it to one of his own shows and they had a bunch of guests drop by to fill in for him. I guess that's something. You're going to listen to him more than once? I don't know.
That was Billy Joel and his version of Maybe I'm Amazed from the Art of McCartney CD set. That came out just a few weeks ago. Our guest today is Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez, and we're taking a look at 2014, the year in Beatles. And Robert, I want to take a look at some of the reissues that came out this year, beginning with the George Harrison Apple Years box set.
Yeah, boy, was that welcome.
Yes, but
Well,
that package
it's always
is
great to have remasters of that stuff,
Yeah.
to get a nicer sounding versions rather than the stuff that got thrown out into the marketplace back in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, and the records are available individually as well.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to to shell out, but it's nice to see like Wonderwall back again on CD.
Yeah, that to me, it's one of my favorite solo Beatle experiments.
Yes,
in that it's got just great mixing of Eastern and Western sounds. You've got Clapton and Ringo and the Remo Four and his Indian musicians. It's a very unsung project of George's. However, you want to speak of missed opportunities. I really regret they didn't put out the mono mix of that at the same time. I don't know if both of them would have fit on one CD. I suspect they would have.
Yeah.
But that was a blown opportunity because, like the Ram mono mix of 71, it is a different listening experience. It would have been nice if they had thought to do that because really, when are they ever going to have this opportunity again?
I will say it's a minor gripe, and I kind of feel I can say this about all these projects, really, but the accompanying DVD, they really could have done more with that.
And it's funny because that was what happened with the Dark Horse years when that came out, and it didn't scoop up all the promos that he did.
Exactly.
It would have been nice because he was a guy that really took that stuff seriously, and it became a filmmaker himself. He was very big on visual representation of his work after a certain point when he really got hip to it. And it's like if you're not going to put the stuff out, everything, when are you going to do it? It's just like when they did the Dark Horse years, they put out Somewhere in England, and they restored the original artwork, but not the original track running order.
Yeah.
It easily could have fit on that CD. Why didn't they do that?
I don't know if you want to get into a little bit of the McCartney reissues, Venus and Mars, Wings at the Speed of Sound. This reissue project finally got running again after what seemed like an interminably long layoff. The bonus material, it's really what I'm interested in, and I think there's more there that should have been on this. I mean, he's collected up the B-sides and that sort of thing, so that's nice.
It is nice, but it's exactly like what happened at Ram, which I thought I was happy to have. Beautiful package. Where's the rest of the stuff?
Right.
It's like you have this opportunity, especially with the deluxe editions where you got all the bells and whistles there for the real hardcores. How about the rest of the stuff that exists that was taped during those sessions? And you can easily have done that with these, every one of these. I have that complaint. It's like they're holding back, and you wonder why. Are they going to do some kind of vault clearing project years down the road? The cold cuts thing that's been promised for years and years and years. I thought that had been permanently shelved, but they're setting aside all this material that could have and should have made sense to come out attached to these reissues of the Wings albums, and they haven't done that. So I have to think that one day it's going to come out as its own freestanding product because it hasn't to this point.
Yeah, and as you say, these deluxe editions of these reissues are pretty expensive. So if you're the hardcore fan, you're going to want these songs that you may have heard on bootleg, some you haven't, and that would be the optimum place to put all that stuff.
Exactly, because if you're a hardcore fan, then you're already at least familiar with the existence of this stuff.
Yeah,
and so the expectation is, oh, good, now I get to hear these cuts that originated from the 74, 75 Venus and Mars sessions or whatever, and instead they give you this half-hearted version of Beware My Love with John Bonham on drums.
Right.
That's nice. It's not what I was hankering for, but okay.
Yeah. Our guest today is Beatles author and expert Robert Rodriguez as we take a look at 2014, the year in Beatles. And Robert, I just thought about this. This wasn't something that we had decided to discuss, but earlier in this year, there was a digital-only release, an EP featuring 4 songs by the solo Beatles. And as far as I know, it's the first time that 4 songs from the Beatles as solo artists were grouped together and sold in a package. Now, it wasn't the Beatles, but I think it was 4 by the Fab Four, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. That was a very curious selection of songs. Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I get from a record label perspective why they did that, because it sort of touted all the 4 separate projects that were coming out.
Right.
So it made sense to cross-promote them like that. I mean, aesthetically and musically, do they jive? Is there a theme? No, not really.
Right. I wonder, though, if that is setting a precedent for something that may happen down the line.
I suspect, and I couldn't tell you what the numbers were on it in terms of sales or attention or anything like that. It just kind of slipped out there between more high-profile releases. But it always struck me as sort of inevitable that once the whole Beatle packaging and repackaging thing got played out, never mind the fact there are still the conspicuous absences that haven't come out, like the Christmas album, Hollywood Bowl, and all that, that they might have been dipping their toe in the waters and seeing, are people responding to this? Because it seems to me inevitable that eventually there's going to be some kind of four-way greatest hits put out, at least.
Yeah.
And maybe further explorations of that. I could see a brilliant idea would be if somebody wanted to do a Beatles love type of mashup with some of the solo material.
That would be amazing. Yeah, Giles Martin could get his hands in that, yeah.
Yeah. So, that's what I kind of looked at it as. I don't think they were swinging for the fences. I think they were kind of looking to see, is there interest to support this?
I'd also like to mention some of the books that came out in 2014, and one of my favorites, kind of an unexpected favorite, is Beatleness by Candy Leonard, which reminds me a bit of Growing Up Beatles by Rob Schomburg.
Yes.
Which was a lot
nice
of fun.
Little study of fandom. I wish there were more things like that, but she does a great job with that. And it's really insightful because I think at this distance is a kind of social history that really needs to be explored, the whole phenomenon and what it meant to that generation. It's a very huge, life-changing thing. And, at this distance, it might be hard for younger people to get a sense of what it was like to have your world rock like that and just completely change the path, your trajectory of, before and after the Beatles came.
That's mine. How about you?
I would say one that comes to mind, and again, I'm not sure if this was late last year, if it came out this year, but it was the Chuck Gunderson, Having Some Fun Tonight. I mean, fantastic. That is something that I'm really glad that somebody did a serious study of the Beatles concerts in North America. I mean, everything you could possibly wish for is in there. It's a massive, slipcase 2-volume set. And I had to bring mine back from California. I was out the fest there in October, and it's just like carrying just bricks in your suitcase.
Right.
It's fantastic. It's really worth it. And it's kind of like in the tradition of the Spicer books, where you're paying a lot of money for it, but it's like the last word on that particular aspect of their career. So I can't imagine anybody bettering it. There was The Fifth Beatle by
the graphic novel,
Yeah, the story of Brian Epstein, and that was like, who saw that coming? It's just been doing tremendously and got him all kinds of attention and awards, and now it's being made into a film. So good on him.
That was John Lennon's home demo of the song I'm in Love from 1963, and that was released on the Beatles' bootleg recordings, 1963, which was released exclusively on iTunes. In other words, you can't go to a record store and buy it. You have to be on iTunes. You have to be on the Internet, and that's how you get the record as a digital-only release. And the reason that was released last year, and it's a big collection, I mean, what is it, like 60 songs or so, the reason that was released was because copyright protection in Europe runs out after 50 years. So what Apple has to do is officially release music from the vaults that have previously been bootlegged. So now we're getting this stuff, like an avalanche of this stuff, in the best quality possible. And the year might not be over, but speculation's out there that we're going to get another one of these compilations released online within the coming days. And what do you think might be on this, Robert?
Well, 1964 was the year that they toured the world. There was a couple, at least, really well-filmed live concerts. You got the 64 Coliseum show in B.C. from February, as well as the stuff that was done in Australia. The Beatles played for Shell. Wonderfully filmed and recorded, documented stuff, anything else that might have come in between, including the 64 Hollywood Bowl show. We didn't hear officially all the songs they played at that show, and it is, all kinds of footage that was done by newsreel crews that some people synced up. I know the Ron Howard project is underway doing this Beatles live documentary. It'll be interesting to see how much of it gets incorporated into that, including stuff that's never been seen before. But yeah, talking about the iTunes end-of-year dump, there surely will be any number of live things in there. And we don't even need to address the BBC stuff because you're talking concerts now, soundboard stuff.
Yep.
There are demo things that exist that have been bootlegged or popped up, like Paul's half a demo of World Without Love for Peter and Gordon. things like that throughout the year exist, and surely there's other studio outtakes that would be interesting to hear that didn't make it to anthology. Like the electric version of Mr. Moonlight without the organ. So,
right.
It's out there.
Well,
Yep.
I think next year, what do we have to look forward to? We have the 50th anniversary of Help.
Yeah,
we have
Ron
Howard's documentary.
Yeah,
hopefully should come out
that's going to be
year.
enormous. In fact, we've got some interconnections with the people working on that we want to talk to before it comes out, and sort of get some insights on that. So that's going to be really cool.
And of course, Let It Be. Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. I maybe Let It Be will come in.
Maybe Let It Be.
Yeah.
And again, if they do it right, maybe it'll be worth the wait. With all the hours of footage they got, we know how pristine it is because we saw bits of it in the anthology. It'd be nice because you can cut an entirely separate 90-minute film of the Let It Be sessions with the film that's out there of them having a blast, as heard on the Niagara reels. Them goofing around and just having fun.
As we start to wrap up here, I do want to mention the fine podcast that you do with fellow Beatles author Richard Buskin. It's a show called Something About the Beatles, and if anyone wants to hear it, it's over at somethingaboutthebeatles.com. And you've got a bunch of episodes now by this point, don't you?
There's about, I think that's the 11th or 12th, but we just cut the holiday show as well, so that'll be going up in the next week.
Very cool. Robert, it is always a pleasure to...
Well, thank you so much for having me. Love talking to you.